this lesson we're looking at ecological sampling. So our dot point is all about stratified sampling, but I want to introduce you to what sampling actually is before we talk about that. Right, taking a sample is a way to get a small selection of something larger to get an idea of what the entire thing is like, right? I can sample a meal, I can do a 3-month trial of Stan, I can take a survey of a group of people at school for their opinions about the tuck shop, and depending on how I take this survey, it can give me an idea of the general opinions of the entire school population, right? So ecological sample is a way to get a small snapshot of an ecosystem which can best represent the ecosystem and the diversity within the wider community. To sample an ecosystem, a small area within the ecosystem must be surveyed, right? And this might mean counting organisms, calculating their density, drawing profiles of the lands, whatever, right? And it's obviously very impractical to consider counting every single organism in the habitat, so the sample has to be representative of the entire ecosystem. Now, we sample so that we can monitor, manage, and conserve our ecosystem. So think back to those discussions on ecosystem management. And this involves monitoring the organisms, both plants and animals, to classify the ecosystems. You could do any measurements or observations like the following, so many options, right? And to do these things, we need, to do the monitoring and the conservation, we need to be able to get qualitative and quantitative data that a sample can provide. So we might want to sample things over a number of years. Now, if we go back to the opinions about the tuck shop, right, ideally I'd want to survey the entire school, but it's impractical. But if I only surveyed, say, the year 12s in my classroom, that wouldn't be ideal either. So it's important to sample fairly so that it represents the demographic mix of all of the students. Now, the same goes for ecosystems. Where there's a variety of habitats within an ecosystem, it's important to sample in a way that accurately represents the entire thing. So we can take a selection of samples from around the ecosystem and make a necessary assumption that these are representative of the entire ecosystem. There's a few ways to design a sampling strategy that ensures that the sample is taken fairly, accurately, and with minimal bias, right? And here are 4 ways. We'll discuss a few of these strategies, but I also want to talk about the techniques used to physically take the measurements and counts, and some of these may be familiar with you from other subjects or junior years of science. It's raining really hard, so I'm really sorry if it's loud. Right, so let's talk about the techniques first so that we discuss the overall strategies. You'll have an idea of what that even looks like, right? Okay, so this is a quadrat. A quadrat is a frame of known size. It can be a rectangle, circle, it's usually a square, which marks out a particular area which is going to be sampled. So they're placed in an ecosystem and the species within them are identified and then recorded. Quadrats are usually made of plastic wire, and they can be divided up into smaller segments to assist with counting within them. They can be placed randomly in a habitat and can be chosen using a random number grid or a grid reference, right? You know, we can be counting small things, big things, whatever is fitting in that quadrat basically, and we can use to count the organisms, measure their abundance, their presence, their absence, calculate their density, their percentage cover, their percentage frequency, whatever it is, right? They're good for plants and small animals, not so good with, say, very highly mobile animals. Alright, a transect line is placed through a community and it acts as a bit of a boundary on which the sampling will take place. So you might use a tape measure or an actual marked line and you'd walk that line. They can show changes in abundance and distribution along a gradient, for example, like as you go up in altitude, or change in temperature, change in the slope, change in the soil, the plant life, as the land moves away from the shoreline, whatever it is, right? So a transect is used to sample systematically, generally, along an environmental gradient. If sampling on a line transect, you'd walk the entire length of the line, you'd record everything you saw on it, or what it passes through. There's usually a little bit of leeway on either side of the transect line, and you can see that you can do this in a very systematic way, say here, or you can do it in a little bit more random way that way. So you can also have quadrats sit alongside that transect. A built transect works basically like a pair of parallel transect lines, and you record everything within them. So the quadrats can be placed in regular intervals in there as well. A point transect collects data at regular intervals along the transect line. It could be alternating each side. It's sort of similar to a belt transect, but in a smaller range. And they're mainly used to calculate percentage cover and density. Profile diagrams, we've probably seen these before. If you're sampling on a transect line, you can actually draw a really good to scale profile diagram. You can see the elevation, and the shape of the land, as well as other geographical features. In places like forests, you can see the levels of vegetation. So you might see the canopy and the understory and the forest floor. We've spoken about mark and recapture before in reference to estimating population size, and this is another technique that focus heavily on mobile animals, because all the other ones really are all about slow-moving animals or vegetation. So you use the Lincoln Index to determine how big the population size is approximately, but really you're capturing, marking, releasing, and then recapturing and checking what tag is there. So the proportion of the marked or tagged animals in that second capture is used to estimate the entire population size. Now, all of these techniques I just mentioned are smaller tools to use within a wider sampling design. For example, if I was surveying the students about the tuck shop by saying, rate 1 to 5 on how good you think it is, I could go about doing that. I could choose to talk to the students in my class just because it was easy. I could just talk to the ones I felt like speaking with today. I could ask every 5th student who walks through the school gate. I could ask 50 kids in each grade, right? The types of sampling strategies used in ecology are similar to any other kind of statistical or population sampling. And we're going to talk about random, systematic, opportunistic, and stratified sampling, and they are quite different. Random sampling can be done if time is limited or if you're in a really large uniform area, so it's not really good for clump distribution. It involves the random selection of data from the entire population so that each possible sample is equally likely to occur. At a basic level, a quadrat can be thrown, randomly within the sampling site, but the human element always comes into play. So it's not always that random, like, you're throwing it towards an area near lots of species. It's also really challenging to randomly sample things like trees. If you're placing a quadrat in an area, you can't throw it over the tree. So it's best to split up the area, say, into a large grid and use a random number generator so that you can sample in an actual random fashion. There's some logistical challenges there, but, it tends to avoid bias. A systematic sample, although the name suggests otherwise, is actually a type of random sampling because everything has equally likely chance of falling into that sampling area. It's a bit more structured, basically. The fixed periodic interval is agreed upon in advance and then adhered to. So you might go every 5 meters along the line on the transect, I am going to dump a quadrat and I'm going to sample that. So if a species is clumped or doesn't have a uniform distribution, you might actually miss it, but basically choosing between random and systematic is going to depend on what kind of area you're sampling in. Opportunistic or convenient sampling is exactly that. It's, hey, I'm just going to see what's accessible to me and get some really quick data. It's a non-random technique and therefore it can be riddled with bias and it might not be representative of the entire community. It's like saying, I want to just ask the Year 12s in my classroom about the tuck shop because it's easy and I don't have to go and speak to anyone else. Stratified sampling is really where we're headed, and it's about proportionally sampling an area. So if you can divide it into certain, say if we're talking about the students, we can divide them into grades. So I want to proportionally sample students from each grade and get a decent representative sample. So in this case, you would split your ecosystem up into sections that are distinct and you would sample proportionally based on how big that area is. This is just about sampling. We are heading into speaking about stratified sampling.